Hello, today we have just Tantram, who is a partner at Terrafiniti, and we have published you already on a couple of occasions. Just, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Virginie. I very much look forward to exploring public value, common good outcomes, those sorts of things. I'm very excited.
Perfect, perfect. We're very happy to have you. My first question to you is, what does public value mean to you as a citizen, as a person?
Well, I think essentially public value means, I suppose, from the citizen's perspective, that we have a stake, a birthright stake in the societies that we're part of. Not necessarily the societies that we grow up in, but the societies that we're part of, that we contribute to, whether we contribute them to them in terms of skills, in terms of our the time that we spend working for our own benefits, but also potentially wider benefits. But also, I suppose, the extent to which we're understood as being citizens rather than consumers, which is one of the challenging things in recent years, that we've increasingly been seen as consumers, and consumers first and citizens next, rather than perhaps the other way around. In terms of the sort of bigger picture of public value, I believe that, and it's sort of congruent with some of the work that we've been doing, that what we need to do is be able to imagine and engineer a system which has a closer connection between the common and shared interests of humanity and systems of value production, of governance, that actually respect and respond to that within the limits of a finite planet.
For quite a long time, companies really consider sustainability as a cherry on the cake, a nice to have feature. And now we see progressively a discourse about really re-engaging with sustainable strategies and having them being core to business. What's the business case of sustainability from your point of view?
The idea behind the business case for sustainability is really to tackle some of the challenges that are inherent in the current economic model, which essentially considers certain things being valuable and therefore capable of being priced, and certain things as being what you might call common good impacts or externalities, so not priced within the current system. And those economic precepts translate into a conception of what is business's problem and what isn't business's problem. So, and fairly clear sort of definitions between what business has to deal with and what society as a whole has to deal with. Now, those of us involved in sustainability are essentially saying, look, there are things that occur because of the normal operation of business based upon the current economic model, which gives rise to costs that are borne outside business, but are and borne by society or borne by the environment, that we cannot afford to ignore. And we cannot afford to ignore them because they are likely to impact upon our ability to continue to operate in the way that we'd like to over the long term. So to some extent, that's the big picture. And the business case for sustainability is essentially trying to translate these sets of externalities. And the externalities will be social impacts, environmental impacts. And what we're trying to do is translate the implications of those back into means, metrics, and messages that businesses understand. So that's big picture stuff.
Are we talking about risk mitigation or about profitability, or both?
Well, essentially, we're talking about both. Companies tend to be pretty adept and pretty comfortable with the idea of risk management, risk identification and management. And so therefore, for those of us interested in sustainability, that presents a way in for us to say, okay, you understand risk, you're comfortable with that. Have you looked at the range of what are currently called non-financial risks, environmental, social risks, that arise from your operations,
yes,
or present a risk to your operations? And so to some extent, risk is a vehicle for companies to be able to understand and interpret how big picture trends or wider social and environmental impacts may impact upon the company's ability to generate profits in the way that it wants to. The second element is perhaps the opportunity side of it. Now, obviously, good risk management is good opportunity management. So to some extent, they're both two sides of the same coin. But there is a larger piece in terms of the idea of value creation and sustainability, which obviously we believe is a good driver because it's an optimistic message, if you like, for companies. What are the things that you can stand to gain in terms of market share, in terms of better share price performance, in terms of better management of risk, that are likely to create value for you as a company? And we tend to say that there are a sort of number of ways in to articulate the business case that, and I think it's important to say, there is no one business case for all companies. There are, however, each company can find a business case for sustainability for them. And that will tend to be from managing their risk, as we've already mentioned, from increasing the efficiency of their use of resources, which has a good cost-benefit relationship, in terms of how investors perceive the management of sustainability as being part of the wider good management, and therefore they see it as being a lower risk to their equity, and also an increasing area which is about intangible value. So the value that is inherent within companies that is not related to their actual the stuff that they own, the kit that they own, etc. And in some companies that can be up to 80% of the value of the company as a whole. And there's been a number of studies which have shown that sustainability, good management, long-term thinking are all elements of intangible value measurements. So those sort of four elements, from direct short-term benefits, risk management, equity performance, so share price performance, and intangibles. The business case for most companies will be somewhere within those four elements.
But for business to become a force for good, as the UN would like it to be, I think most companies need to understand the opportunity for profitability. They need to make money while becoming new change agents. So I think it's important to show the impact they have on the world and that the world has on them.
Yeah.
But how do you explain to them that they can also make money and they can actually become real drivers?
Well, I think it's a mix of things, from I suppose highlighting those companies that have made that leap into articulating themselves as sustainability organizations, or who have put sustainability at the heart of their strategy, and to be able to show how those companies are increasing their market share, reducing their risk, getting better share price performance. It tends to be, and there is some very good evidence about the alignment between more sustainable companies and better share price performance. It tends to be, you can always find companies that aren't sustainable that do very well. So I think it's important to say, it's not the only answer. However, there's quite a good case for seeing an alignment between reduced share volatility and more sustainable business. I think so. There's this combination of highlighting those people that are leaders in that area. I think there's also highlighting how thinking about sustainability opens up the possibility of innovation, and that's something that we've done with a number of our clients, where we have been able to uncover potential opportunities for money saving or for value creation. And when we talk about value creation, we're talking about increased market share, or better reputation, or different dynamics of relationships with customers. And we've often found that sustainability can be a very good way of allowing people to think about things they may already have thought about, but perhaps in a different way. So one of the companies we've worked with, we're having a sustainability conversation, and they thought about, well, hang on, there's a logistics and supply issue that we've sort of wrestled with but haven't been able to take forward, that is actually about efficiency and cost saving, but it also has a huge carbon benefit. to making that change. And it was something they knew about, but the sustainability conversation allowed them to take it forward. I think another example from a client of ours was essentially a conversation they had with one of their big customers who were interested in their sustainability plans and performance. And as a result of that conversation, they said, well, we'd like to move you from a 2-year contract to a 5-year contract because we see you as being a strategic partner in this area that can help minimize our risk in terms of sustainability. So what you have there is a value creation opportunity coming as a result of the company thinking differently about sustainability and demonstrating it knew its risks, and it had ways of dealing with those risks and ensuring continuity of supply and quality of supply without the types of social and environmental impacts that might occur on those value chains.
All right. Terrafiniti and you personally has also written quite a lot about the very big picture, and you have a series of books which I find absolutely fascinating that you have called Towards 9 Billion. Just give us the core interest of Towards 9 Billion, the core message.
Towards 9 billion, I suppose, is essentially asking a couple of questions. And the main one is what if we could welcome the arrival of 9.5 or 10 billion people rather than fearing their arrival? And what changes would we need to make in our systems of value and production in order to do that? So to some extent, and the reason why we're asking that question is because based upon current demographic changes, we do have lots of people joining us on this planet. And we tend to see that as a risk, and it certainly is a risk if we are, as a planet, have 9.5 or 10 billion people consuming at the inefficient rates that those of us in the West are doing. However, the point of Towards 9 billion is to say, does it have to be like that? Does the relationship between numbers of people on the planet and our impact upon the planet need to be immutable? And how do we identify and understand ways of delivering value and delivering good quality of life and equity for the people that are joining us on this planet in ways that respect, respond to, and strengthen the quality and quantity of life on the planet as well? So it's a very big picture thing, which is saying, hang on, can we think about a market, a world of 9.5 or 10 billion people active in economies, active in using their skills, their intelligence for their own good, but potentially for the good of society as a whole? Are there ways for us to imagine how that might work in such a way that we have a sustainable and equitable future?
Are we asking the Western companies to do less, which they wouldn't like?
No, really? I think we tend to talk about sustainability as one of two things, possibly both things at once. It's either doing the same things very differently or doing very different things. Now, is it utopian? It's hopeful, I would say. So what it's saying essentially is, are the seeds of a sustainable future, do they already exist within the current system? And our hope is that they do. There are huge challenges in reorientating a system towards recognizing limits and working within those limits, and reorientating a system towards equity rather than competition. And we're not saying there should be no competition, but if you have a species which is capable of impacting the planet itself, and I think there should be pretty much no doubt about that, then we really need to turn our heads towards a stewardship model rather than an exploitation model. And current capitalism is based, broadly speaking, upon exploitation. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. It takes stuff, it uses it, and it throws it away. And we need to think about, actually, value needs to come from strengthening and enhancing the quality and quantity of life and the equity between people, rather than in ignoring those things as performance parameters.
So equity versus competition, we're talking about a profound cultural change rather than economic change.
Yeah, I mean, or it requires a shift in what we consider we need to compete about, and to some extent, and you've got sort of elements of this being played with in the real world. So you've got the idea of universal basic income, which is
Yes.
essentially saying that we shouldn't have societies where people have to compete for the basics of life, and we would much rather see that that we compete to be creative and innovative, rather than we compete for the next morsel of bread, or the drink of water, or the breath of fresh air. Competing for the fundamentals of life is not a way to operate for a planetary species at scale. It'll get very nasty very soon. So to some extent,
yeah, it's not equitable and not fair, in addition.
no, absolutely. So I think we would like to shift where competition happens, if you like. So it's rather than I'm going to fight you for the only morsel of bread, it's more, we have plenty of bread, let's think about different ways of creating new types of loaves. It's a rubbish example.
New types of growth, and being creative and innovative, we're tapping into profound cultural change and education, aren't we?
We are, yes. And I think, although, well, I think the challenge that all of us have is that we have fairly well embedded systems of value, systems of production, and also cultural understandings about what the nature and purpose of different institutions are. But those aren't immutable. If you go back to the history of many of the biggest companies that we see in the world, very many of them were set up with quite different ethical frameworks. I mean, certainly in the UK, we have a number of organizations, many of them now big commercial banks, that were set up under Quaker principles. And if you look at, the sort of founding credos of a number of the companies that we see in the world, they were often talking about delivering access to goods and services, access to market in such a way that wasn't exploitative. Now, that's not to say that that's the world that we live in now, but it's not always been the case that capital is inevitably about creating the most wealth for the fewest number of people. But there is a big shift required. It's an optimistic intention rather than always a realistic one. But I think we have to temper our optimism, or we have to map a path between where we are now and where we need to get to.
Well, I think this is indeed very optimistic, but I also hear, in other words, but a similar discourse. In 2020, Japan is at the head of the G20. They did consider climate change as their main priority, and they are talking a lot of a paradigm change. And we can hear and see the kids in the street on Fridays very often, who consider that it's about their own future. They're quite right doing so. It's about them, it's about their survival. So the discourse is here. Let's consider the discourse is here. How can we get into implementation? What we hear is a bit of companies, states, and citizens being overwhelmed.
Absolutely. Businesses may sometimes fight tooth and nail against new regulation or new taxation, but to some extent they also have quite a good track record if there is a clear pathway of change that's established through regulation or policy implementation. Very often, once that's established, companies will turn their attentions to how do we use our skills, our capabilities, our expertise to innovate and to create value for ourselves along this pathway. It's not impossible at all for companies to get their head around doing the things that they do best along a line, but there needs to be some certainty. And this is where I think the Paris Accord is a powerful element of that, because it articulates a transition pathway that's required. And you've also got initiatives like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which essentially is asking companies to sign up to carbon reduction processes and targets, which will lead to their contribution towards a 1.5 degree world, which is what we need to be achieving in the next 12 years. So I think this idea of regulatory certainty is a key element. There are going to be challenges in certain ways that market dynamics work, which currently focus around short-term gains at the perhaps expense of long-term value. So there are potentially some market changes that are required, but there's also been some very encouraging other elements. So like the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which came out of a Bank of England sort of sponsored or initiated process, which is essentially asking companies to disclose their climate risks, their transition risks, and their adaptation risks. And that has been adopted by, I think it's around, and I could be wrong, around 500 companies now. It's being in the UK. The pensions regulator is requiring pension schemes to disclose information around their climate risks. There are some important things that are moving in this area, and indications from policymakers and regulators about the pathway, the direction that companies will need to go. And we're also seeing companies responding quite positively to that. The challenge is to do that around other big picture environmental issues, which is an emerging one. And hopefully we'll find some very quick progress in the next few years.
Right, so institutions are in place in a way. The international organizations are there and they still have a big role to play, maybe one of the biggest roles they ever had since World War II.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's important to say that we don't, those institutions are still challenged. You know, we've seen things in the political world in the last few years that are perhaps moving against the idea of consensus, global consensus on how we have governance processes, how we deal with issues that relate to environmental issues, you know, what you might call commons issues. So I think it's important to say that we don't have the sorts of global consensus and global institutions that we perhaps might need to think more collectively about our common future. But there are elements of international consensus that have really come on in the last few years, and I think climate change is one. And let's need to recognise that the US is not necessarily seeking to play the role that the previous government was committing them to. So there are challenges, but I tend to call this the sort of golden hour for humanity. And the golden hour is a concept stolen from the medical profession, and it refers to the period after injury where a patient stands the best chance of recovery. And if we take that for humanity, essentially we do have international institutions and processes that might allow collective action. We do have the scientific knowledge that allows us to identify what the problems are and what the types of action that would ameliorate or address those problems are. And we also have the resources, if we sought to deploy them towards those problems, that would be much more efficiently spent solving the problems than responding to the implications or the impacts of those problems once they manifest. So I think the idea of a sort of golden hour for humanity is one that's worth exploring a little bit.
It is, and it's also very optimistic, which is in these days is quite useful to have some optimistic goal. So the non-consensual part remains on the how and not on the whether we should actually move forward.
Yeah, and I think that lots of different organizations and people are sort of toying at different ways of the how, you know, and the how is likely to be around political consensus. And that's not necessarily everyone agreeing on every aspect of everything, but understanding what the types of trajectories that are going to be required in terms of responding to climate change, in terms of responding to biodiversity loss and enhancing natural and social capital and these sorts of issues. I think the there's lots of work going in around, well, what's the sort of plumbing of the economic system and the capitalist system? And elements of the plumbing are around accounting processes. And accounting processes, whilst they might seem boring to many of us, are essentially processes to recognize value.
Right.
And the opportunities perhaps to adjust how accounting processes recognize different types of value that hasn't currently been within the economic system. This refers back to what I was saying earlier about externalities. Accounting processes which may be requiring companies to think in more long-term ways about their viability. So a couple of examples of that would be, in the UK, we have a requirement for companies to produce a viability statement. And that's notionally saying how viable is this company in the longer term, although currently it still has quite a small time threshold. We have things like the accounting principle of going concern, which is where accountants and auditors are required to assess a company, its capabilities, its strategy, its potential market, etc., and essentially make a judgment as to whether that company is a going concern. And that's a really interesting one. It could be very, very useful for assessing whether a company is likely and capable of being sustainable over the next 5 or 10 years. Currently, it's applied at a 1-year time threshold. So an accountant or an auditor is asked, is this going to be company going to be a going concern in the next year? What would be more interesting is saying, how would it be a going concern in 5 or 10 years? And if you're using that time threshold, it immediately ask questions about resource use, about impacts on climate change, about access to market, about supporting and strengthening societies, and lots of much bigger questions about what the nature and purpose of a sustainable company should be.
So what would you say the next step, where the next step should happen to have this shift in accounting?
A number of the accounting standard setters are exploring these issues, whether it be with regard to what they call multiple capitals accounting. So that would be how a company understands its relationship to, dependency upon, and vulnerability to change in the natural world, and to change in human and social capital. There is also a lot of work with international accounting bodies on concepts of value. And what are the mechanisms that might allow us to compound value over time rather than discount it? And that really refers to the idea of saying, how do you project value into the future, and how do you get companies to connect with greater value over time, as well as delivering on some of the sort of short-term profit requirements that they have. So accounting bodies, actuaries are also very interesting in this area, because actuaries are one of the few professions that really have not quite a multi-generational, but yeah, a long-term perspective on the performance of companies and investments. You're also getting pension funds, obviously, have an interest in being able to deliver against commitments in over a 25, 30 or 40-year time horizon. So there are a number of people whose job requires them to think on a multi-decade basis. And those people are starting to see how environmental change and social change could present serious risks to their interest over time. So you've got, as I mentioned earlier, things like the UK pension regulator requiring pension funds to disclose different types of information about the performance of their fund. And I think those sorts of things are going to accelerate. So you've got some rules changes, you've got some disclosure requirement changes, and you've also got people thinking differently about the systems that underlie, or the plumbing of capitalism may be re-engineered to give rise to different longer-term outcomes.
Interesting, really interesting. But I take away that beyond the discourse on values that we hear almost across the world today, because even in the US at regional level, we do hear similar discourses. To make it happen, or to be able to implement such a discourse, we need two leverages. we actually need to rely on regulators first and foremost, and we need to use accounting systems as a tool to show, to demonstrate how important this is, and also to basically measure impact. The problem is about measurement at one point. If we remain in a competitive world, we still need agreeable to all measurement framework.
Many years ago, I was lucky enough to be part of organising a launch event in the UK for a book called Natural Capitalism by Amory Lovins, Hunter Lovins and Paul Hawken, which is still the most amazing book, and you can find its chapters for free on the internet. It's called Natural Capitalism. And one of the things that Amory Lovins said at the launch event was there are a number of ways, we already know many of the ways that companies can understand, respond and innovate their business systems and processes to deliver their value within the limits of the planet. And there is a great opportunity for companies that get that to act in advance of the rules telling them to. And I think we see, I mean, these examples are used all the time, but we see companies like Interface, which was very, the leader, Ray Anderson, was very much informed by Paul Hawken's work, Factor 4, Factor 10, etc., and the natural capitalism work. And he essentially said, right, well, we're not waiting for regulation to tell us to do this. We believe that as an organization, we need to operate within the limits of the planet. And he called it climbing Mount Sustainability, and set them on a pathway which has been for the last 25 years to radically change the resources they depend upon, their business model, their manufacturing processes, the way they relate to customers, all of those things. And they've been very successful in that, and they've also created a wider impact within their market. So other companies within their market have adopted very similar principles. So there is always a role for positive mavericks. And another example perhaps would be Unilever, where they are a company that for a number of their products are dependent upon biological systems, biological productivity, stuff that grows in the ground that they harvest and they manufacture. And I think those companies that have a big biological supply chain, who are looking over the next 25, 30 years and still want to be able to supply their goods and services, really are recognizing that they need to behave in a more stewardship role. And this is something that Unilever have taken on very seriously. And they've also talked about balancing or pushing back on how the market requires short-term results all the time. So they stopped doing quarterly reports because they said it was a distraction. They essentially said that their goal was to deliver value over the long term according to their long-term 2030 plan, and that analysts could see how they were delivering that, but being distracted by saying, well, how did we do in the last quarter, was actually not getting them anywhere. So whilst I believe that there is a need for a change to the plumbing of the system, there is also a role for companies to grasp even now. And I think that's well worth emphasizing. Let's not wait for someone else to solve it. We obviously need to play our role in changing the plumbing, the mechanics of the system. But there's also a very big opportunities for companies to just get on with things now.
Interesting, really, just so stewardship is really your key word.
At sufficient scale and over sufficient periods of time, common interests should be indistinguishable from the private interest. As a species, we are big enough to see the limits of our planet. And once we see the limits of our planet, we need to turn our minds to stewardship rather than exploitation. So I think that's the sort of summary, I think, of the stewardship piece for me.
Thank you again. Thank you, Jess, and talk to you very soon.
Thanks, Virginie. It's been a pleasure.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.